The relentless December wind howled through the dense pines of northern Minnesota, carrying whispers of snow and secrets long buried beneath the frozen earth. Nestled in a secluded clearing, surrounded by a fortress of ancient trees, stood a rustic cabin, its smokestack puffing like a weary dragon. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burning cedar, and the crackling of the fire provided a small sanctuary from the bitter cold outside. Silas, a grizzled hunter whose eyes mirrored the wild and untamed woods, stoked the fire, sending sparks dancing towards the soot-blackened hearth. Around him gathered a motley crew of seasoned hunters, each worn by winters and marked by battles with nature's fiercest. There was Tom, broad-shouldered and silent, his gaze often lost in the flickering flames. Beside him sat Jasper, whose laughter came as easily as breathing, though tonight his chuckles were subdued, swallowed by the shadows that crept around the cabin's corners. Completing the circle was Ellie, the youngest and most restless of the group, her legs bouncing nervously as the wind moaned a ghostly lament. The cabin, built by hand decades ago by hunters who respected the wood's ancient pact, take only what you need and honor the spirits that roam, had always been a place of refuge and stories. Tonight, as the storm brewed its icy art outside, Silas decided it was time to pass on a tale not often spoken but heavy with the weight of caution and dread. "You know," Silas began, his voice a low rumble as he leaned forward, his hands extended towards the warmth, "these woods hold more than deer and bear. They keep secrets, old and dark as the soil." The others listened, the wind's howling crescendo lending a dramatic flair to his words. Many winters ago, when the snow fell thicker than the fur on a wolf's back, a hunter named Elias ventured farther than any soul dared. He was after the giant bucks spoken of in hushed tones in bars and around fires like this one. Tom shifted, throwing another log onto the fire, which hissed and spat angrily as the wood began to catch. Elias was like us, not one to fear the whispers of old wives' tales. But that winter, Silas's voice dropped, he found himself trapped by a storm so fierce it seemed the world itself might end. Ellie leaned in, her earlier restlessness replaced by rapt attention. Starved and delirious, Elias made a choice that would damn him forever. Silas paused, letting the gravity of his words sink in. In his desperation, he resorted to consuming the flesh of his companion, dead from the cold and the hunger. A collective gasp rose from the group, even though they were all too familiar with the brutal realities of survival in the wilderness. Such acts, Silas continued, awaken the Wendigo, a spirit of winter, famine, and cannibalism. It's said that once you consume human flesh, the Wendigo's curse seizes your soul, twisting your humanity into something grotesque. Outside, a branch snapped under the weight of snow, sounding eerily like breaking bones. The hunters instinctively drew closer to the fire, as if its light could ward off the darkness encroaching upon their sanctuary. Elias, tormented by an insatiable hunger, was transformed. No longer a man, not quite a beast, he roamed these woods. An outcast, a shadow of hunger, driven to consume those who dare to wander alone. Silas's eyes flicked to the window where the snow seemed to press against the glass like curious specters. The Wendigo that Elias became is still said to roam, a reminder of nature's law and the thin line between man and monster. Silas concluded, his voice almost swallowed by a gust of wind that rattled the cabin. The hunters sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The legend of the Wendigo, as much a part of the woods as the trees and the snow, was a tale of warning, about greed, about desperation, about the primal instincts that could lead even the strongest men astray. As the fire settled into a steady burn, the howl of the wind seemed to carry a warning, or perhaps it was an invitation, to remember that out there, in the vast, unyielding wilderness, they were never truly alone. The flicker of the fire cast haunting shadows on the walls of the cabin as Silas's tale seeped into the bones of his fellow hunters. The crackle of the burning wood mimicked the harsh snaps of frozen branches in the depth of the woods, a chilling reminder of the cruel winter outside. "The story of Elias doesn't start with his downfall," Silas continued, the glow from the fire highlighting the deep lines etched into his weathered face. "It began as any of ours might, out of necessity, a passion for the hunt, and a respect for these woods that feed us. Many years earlier, Elias was renowned throughout the northern counties, not just for his skills as a marksman but for his unmatched intuition in tracking the elusive wildlife that thrived in the harsh Minnesota winters. He had a wife and a young son who awaited his return each season with the promise of safety and sustenance. However, one particularly harsh winter, the game seemed to vanish like smoke in the wind. The deer, the rabbits, even the birds seemed to have been swallowed by the forest. Elias watched as his supplies dwindled, his son's cheeks growing hollower with each passing day, Silas narrated, the somber tone softening slightly with empathy. Determined to not return home empty-handed, Elias made the fateful decision to venture deeper into the forest than he, or any other hunter, had dared before. The hunters in the cabin shifted uncomfortably, the cold seeping through the log walls as if inviting the past's icy fingers to creep closer. Silas glanced around, ensuring he held each of their gazes before he proceeded. He packed for weeks in the wild, crossing into territories marked by old totems, signs left by the indigenous tribes, warning of cursed lands, sacred and untouched. Lands that harbored spirits not to be trifled with. Silas's voice dipped lower, each word heavy with foreboding. Elias, driven by desperation and the fierce instinct to provide for his family, ignored these warnings. Days turned into weeks, and the silent woods offered no respite, no sign of life save for the crunch of his own boots on the snow. His rifle, once a trusted tool of his livelihood, hung heavy on his back, unused. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a bloody glow over the snow, Elias stumbled upon a frozen creek. The silence was shattered by a sudden sharp crack, the ice underfoot fracturing. His heart leapt as his eyes caught sight of a dark figure darting through the trees on the opposite bank, a figure that moved with a haunting familiarity of a human form. Elias called out, his voice hoarse, but the figure vanished, leaving behind a trail of footprints in the snow. Driven by a mix of fear and hope, he followed, believing it might be another hunter, a companion from whom he could seek help, Silas explained, his own breath visible in the cold air of the cabin. The trail led Elias to an ancient grove, where the trees stood so closely together they seemed to whisper secrets in the wind. The footprints ended at the base of a gnarled old oak, its branches twisted in agony, reaching for the sky. It was there that Elias found the remains of a camp, long abandoned, or so it seemed. Among the remnants, he discovered a small, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. With shaking hands, Elias read the journal by the light of his flickering lantern. It spoke of a hunger that could not be sated, of a man who had eaten the flesh of his brother to survive, only to be consumed by an endless craving. Silas paused, letting the horror of the realization dawn on his listeners. It was here that the path of Elias's fate met the legend of the Wendigo. That night, as the wind howled like the cries of the damned, Elias heard whispers in the darkness. Shadows flitted between the trees, watching, waiting. Paralyzed by dread, yet driven by a maddening hunger, Elias made the harrowing choice to do the unthinkable. When he finally returned to the edge of civilization, something in him had changed. His eyes, once warm, were now hollow pools of despair. His hands trembled, and his voice was but a whisper of its former self. Silas finished, his voice almost lost to the sound of the storm raging outside. The hunters sat in silence, the reality of Elias's transformation settling in like frost upon the windowpane. Silas's story wasn't just a tale of caution. It was a grim reminder of the thin line they all walked between man and monster in the unforgiving wilderness. As the fire dwindled to coals, the hunters were left to ponder the darkness not just outside their cabin, but within themselves. The curse of Elias was a manifestation of the darkest parts of the human soul, a warning that the hunger driving one to survive could also lead to one's damnation. As the embers in the fireplace cast a weak, flickering light across the cabin's rough-hewn interior, the hunters sat wrapped in a palpable silence. Silas's tale, dense with the frost of fear and the chill of foreboding, lingered in the air like the bitter winter outside. Each man and woman was lost in thought, grappling with the grim imagery of Elias's transformation into something less than human, something cursed. Ellie was the first to break the silence, her voice a tentative whisper against the howling wind that battered the wooden walls. "Do you really believe it, Silas? That he became a Wendigo?" Her eyes, wide and reflecting the firelight, searched the old hunter's face for signs of doubt. Silas, his features carved from years of facing down both beasts and blizzards, nodded slowly. "I do," he said, his voice steady as the ancient pines surrounding their shelter. "I've seen too much in these woods not to believe. There's a truth in the legends, a warning. The forest has eyes, and it remembers the hunger that walks on two legs." Tom, the strong, silent type who had spent more years in the wilderness than in the company of civilization, shifted uncomfortably. "I've heard whispers myself," he admitted reluctantly, staring into the fire as if it could burn away his unease. "Old trappers talk, you know. They say things about shadows moving against the wind, about cries that ain't animal nor human. Jasper, whose laughter had earlier filled the cabin, now clutched his mug of coffee like a lifeline, the humor drained from his face. It's one thing to swap ghost stories and another to think you might be sharing these woods with that. He gestured vaguely with his free hand, as though afraid to say the word Wendigo aloud. Legends often start from truth, Silas said, adding another log to the fire. The flames leapt up, throwing grotesque shadows against the walls, as if eager to confirm his words. What better way to keep the balance, to warn us off certain paths, than through stories passed down from one generation to the next? The wind shrieked a banshee's wail, causing the cabin to creak ominously. Outside, the world was a blur of snow and darkness, the perfect canvas for the mind to paint horrors upon. Ellie wrapped her arms around herself, the cold seeping through the cabin's defenses and into her bones. So what happened to Elias? Did he just disappear into legend? Her voice held a mix of fear and fascination, the story ensnaring her rational mind with its primal grip. Silas looked at each of them, his gaze piercing. Not quite. There have been sightings, tales of a creature both gaunt and towering, with eyes like burning coals. They say it moves with the blizzards, when the air is so cold it freezes your breath in your lungs. He paused, allowing the image to seep into their imaginations. Some folk say they found deer, torn apart, not eaten but destroyed, as if out of rage or sorrow. And sometimes, human footprints lead into the forest, disappearing into nothingness where no man could have survived. The hunters exchanged uneasy glances, the warmth of the fire doing little to thaw the chill that had settled deep within them. And the disappearances, Silas continued, his voice a low rumble against the storm's fury. Every few years, someone vanishes. Could be they got lost, or the cold got them, or maybe— He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Jasper set down his mug, the coffee untouched and cold. You think the Wendigo took them? His question hung in the air, heavier than the snow on the branches outside. Could be, Silas conceded, staring into the fire. Or perhaps they walked into the woods too hungry, too desperate, and found themselves crossing that line Elias did. Maybe the Wendigo isn't just one man or beast. Maybe it's the darkness in all of us, waiting. The notion settled over the cabin, a spectral shroud more suffocating than the storm outside. As the fire dwindled and the night deepened, the hunters felt the weight of their isolation, the vast wilderness around them no longer just a source of life, but a shadowed realm where legend stalked just beyond the reach of the firelight. As they prepared for bed, their weapons within easy reach, the howl of the wind seemed to carry voices, the cries of the damned, or perhaps warnings from those who had walked these paths before and had paid the ultimate price. The boundary between tales and truth blurred, stitched together by fear and the undeniable fact that, in the wilderness, survival was never guaranteed, and some appetites were never meant to be sated. As dawn broke, a pale light filtered through the thick clouds, casting a ghostly pall over the snow-covered landscape. The storm had passed, leaving behind an uneasy calm that settled over the forest like a shroud. The hunters, their sleep fitful and haunted by dreams of shadows and screams, gathered their gear with more silence than usual, each lost in their thoughts about the chilling tales from the night before. Tom was the first to break the morning silence, his voice a low grunt as he checked the load in his rifle. We'll need to move if we want to make it back with any game. Storm might have driven the deer down lower. Ellie nodded, pulling her parka tighter around her. The cold was biting, invasive, as if it sought to creep into their bones and remind them of their vulnerability. We should try the southern ridge, she suggested. The snow drifts aren't as bad there. Might have better luck. Silas, looking more aged in the day's weak light, agreed with a solemn nod. Keep close, though. These woods are unforgiving, and we know now what might be lurking out here with us. His gaze swept the tree-line, a stark silhouette against the brightening sky. They set out, their boots crunching through the fresh snow, leaving a trail of dark footprints behind them. The forest was eerily silent, the usual chirps and calls of wildlife muted, as if the creatures that inhabited these woods sensed the unease of their human intruders. As they trekked, Jasper, ever the storyteller, tried to lighten the mood. You know, they say that after a big storm, the world is clean and new, as if given a second chance. His attempt at humor, however, fell flat, absorbed by the thick blanket of snow that muffled sound and hope alike. The hunters spread out in a loose line as they approached the southern ridge, their eyes scanning the white expanse for any sign of life. It was Ellie who first spotted the tracks, nearly hidden beneath a layer of new snow. "Over here!" she called out, her voice barely louder than a whisper. The others gathered, crouching around the discovery. The tracks were fresh, the edges sharp and defined. Deer, most likely, but something was off. The spacing was erratic, as if the animal had been running or chasing. Tom followed the tracks with his eyes, leading into a thicket of gnarled old pines. "Could be we spooked it on our way in," he mused, though his tone lacked conviction. "Or it was spooked by something else," Silas added darkly, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. They followed the tracks, the tension between them palpable. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees leaning closer, their branches like the twisted fingers of a witch's hand. As they neared the thicket, a sudden movement to the left caught their attention. A shadow darted between the trees, too quick to identify. Ellie's heart raced, her finger tightening around the trigger of her rifle. "Did you see that?" she hissed, her eyes wide as she searched the shadows. Silas raised a hand, signaling them to halt. "Hold. It could be anything. Stay sharp, and don't fire unless you have a clear shot. We don't need a stray bullet out here." They moved forward cautiously, their eyes darting from tree to tree. The shadow appeared again, this time on the right, just a glimpse of something dark and swift, a fleeting impression of gaunt limbs and a distorted figure that seemed to meld back into the woods as quickly as it appeared. The atmosphere was charged, each hunter acutely aware of their isolation and the stories of the Wendigo fresh in their minds. The wind picked up, sending a shiver through the trees, their branches creaking ominously. They reached the edge of the thicket, the deer tracks leading into a dense patch of undergrowth. Tom approached first, parting the branches with the barrel of his rifle. There, in a small clearing, lay the remains of a deer. But it was no ordinary predation. The scene was a gruesome tableau of violence. The deer's body was torn apart, not eaten but savaged, its entrails strewn about in a pattern that spoke more of rage than hunger. Jasper turned away, his face pale, his earlier bravado gone. "This wasn't the work of any bear or wolf," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. Silas surveyed the carnage, his expression grim. "No, it wasn't. We're dealing with something else, something much worse." His words hung heavy in the cold air, each hunter feeling the weight of their fears solidifying into a cold knot in their stomachs. As they stood in the clearing, surrounded by the silence of the forest and the violent end of the deer, the reality of their situation became clear. They were no longer just hunters, they were also the hunted. The lines blurred, and in the shadows of the forest, eyes watched, patient and hungry. The discovery of the savage deer carcass left a palpable tension hanging in the frosty air. The hunters gathered in a loose circle, their rifles held a bit tighter, their eyes scanning the thicket's edge where shadows seemed to twitch with unseen movement. Silence had descended over the group, a heavy, suffocating blanket that muffled even the sound of their breaths crystallizing in the cold. "We should head back," Ellie suggested, her voice low, trying to mask the tremor of fear that threatened to break through. "Whatever did this is not something we're prepared to handle." Tom nodded, his face set in a hard, grim line as he surveyed the clearing. "Agree. We pack up and move now." His usual reticence replaced by the urgency of command. Silas, however, hesitated, his gaze lingering on the torn remains and the blood-stained snow. "We could be walking right back into its path. We need a strategy, not just quick feet. Remember, this creature knows these woods better than we ever will." Jasper swallowed hard, his earlier attempts at humor completely evaporated. "Silas is right. We should make a controlled retreat. Keep to open spaces where we can see it coming." The plan set, they moved with renewed purpose, their formation tight and alert. Every rustle of wind, every crack of frozen wood underfoot spiked their adrenaline, fueling a mixture of fear and the instinctual need to survive. As they traversed the ridge, the sun began its descent, casting elongated shadows that twisted and morphed with the waning light. The beauty of the sunset, normally a moment of awe in the solitude of the wilderness, now seemed like a harbinger of darkness, of vulnerability. Ellie, bringing up the rear, kept glancing over her shoulder, her rifle ready. The earlier glimpse of something darting between the trees had etched itself into her mind, a persistent threat that stalked them just beyond sight. "I feel like we're being watched," she murmured to Tom, who was keeping pace beside her. "We likely are," Tom replied, his voice steady but his eyes constantly moving, searching. "Keep focused. Anything out of place, you let us know fast." Their path took them through a narrow valley flanked by steep slopes, good for keeping the wind at their backs but bad for escape routes. The snow here was deeper, the going tougher, and each step felt like a gamble. Suddenly, Jasper, who was leading, stopped dead. He raised his hand, signaling for silence. Everyone halted, their breaths held, as they listened. A faint, almost imperceptible crunch echoed softly from the slope to their right. It was rhythmic, deliberate, footsteps. "Eyes up," Jasper hissed, shifting his position to face the slope. The others followed suit, forming a defensive circle, their weapons pointed outward. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive, the tension almost tangible. Then, without warning, a figure appeared atop the ridge, silhouetted against the sky's dying light. It was tall, gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long and its stance eerily human. Silas breathed out slowly, his experienced eyes narrowing. "Don't shoot," he commanded softly. "Not yet. We need to be sure." The figure stood motionless, watching them. Then, as if deciding they were not a threat, or perhaps not worth the effort, it turned, disappearing back over the ridge with fluid, haunting grace. "What the hell was that?" Ellie whispered, her voice shaking. "A warning," Silas replied. "Or a scout. It's testing us, learning our reactions." "We can't stay here," Tom said. "It's getting dark, and that's when things will get worse. We move now." The group quickened their pace, pushing through the deepening snow and fading light. As darkness enveloped the forest, they used their headlamps to cut through the blackness, casting eerie tunnels of light that seemed to be swallowed up by the forest. Night in the wilderness was a chorus of sounds, normally a comforting natural symphony to the seasoned hunter. But tonight, each crack and rustle was a potential threat, turning the symphony into a cacophony of paranoia. They decided to make camp in a small clearing, protected by a circle of large boulders that could serve as a temporary shelter and a vantage point. The fire was started with trembling hands and fed generously, its light a small island of safety in a sea of darkness. As they huddled around the flames, the reality of their situation settled around them like the cold. They were not alone. And somewhere out there, in the shadowy confines of the forest, eyes watched, waiting for the fire to die. A chill ran down each hunter's spine as the mournful howl reverberated through the cavernous depths of the cave, a sound so laden with sorrow and longing it seemed to seep into their very bones. Ellie clutched the photo album close, her other hand gripping her rifle with white-knuckled intensity. The realization that they were in the heart of the Wendigo's lair, possibly with the creature itself lurking in the unseen recesses of the darkness, instilled a primal fear that was hard to shake. Silas, ever the leader, his face etched with lines of both age and resolve, motioned for calm. "Stay focused," he whispered harshly, his eyes scanning the shadows that danced just beyond the beam of Tom's flashlight. "It might be trying to scare us off, or worse, lure us deeper. We move back, slow and steady." They began retracing their steps through the cave, the air thick with the stench of decay and the palpable presence of something watching, waiting. As they neared the entrance, Jasper suddenly froze, his face draining of color. "I heard something outside," he gasped, his voice trembling with dread. They crouched, extinguishing the flashlight to avoid drawing attention, and listened. The sound was faint at first, like the wind whispering through the trees, but gradually it grew clearer, footsteps, deliberate and slow, crunching the snow outside the cave. Tom peered cautiously around the cave's mouth, his rifle poised. The daylight seemed too dim, as if the sun itself was reluctant to reveal what awaited them. "Something's out there, circling the entrance," he reported back, his voice low. "Can't see well enough. It's just shadows and movement." Silas made a decision. "We can't stay trapped here. We'll use the side exit, move into the woods, and circle back to the camp. Keep your eyes open and watch each other's backs." They edged toward the lesser-known side passage Silas had spotted earlier, a narrow, barely visible opening concealed by rocks and shadows. Pushing through, they found themselves emerging into a dense thicket, the forest closing around them like a dark, cold embrace. The woods were eerily silent, the usual sounds of wildlife conspicuously absent as if the forest itself held its breath. The snow underfoot was fresh, undisturbed except for the ominous sets of tracks that occasionally intersected their path, tracks that were decidedly not human. As they navigated through the dense underbrush, Ellie's voice suddenly broke through the silence, strained and urgent. "Wait. Where's Jasper?" They halted, a surge of panic rising as they realized Jasper was no longer among them. Silas cursed under his breath, turning to scan the way they had come. "He was just behind me," he muttered, frustration and worry creasing his brow. "Jasper!" Tom called out, his voice carrying through the trees. Only the mocking echo of his own call answered back. They regrouped, facing the grim possibility of a man lost, or taken, in such dire circumstances. "We have to find him," Ellie insisted, her expression set with determination. "He couldn't have gone far." Silas agreed with a nod. "We split up." "No, listen," he said as he saw the protest forming on Tom's lips. "We split up, but stay within earshot. Use the whistles if you find anything, or if you get into trouble. We'll meet back here in 15 minutes, no matter what." They separated, each taking a different direction, their calls for Jasper growing more desperate as the time ticked by, and the silence answered back with nothing but the rustling of leaves and the occasional distant snap of a twig. Ellie, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and cold, pushed through a particularly thick set of bushes and found herself in a small clearing. Her eyes caught on something unusual, a piece of fabric, torn and fluttering gently from a low-hanging branch. It was from Jasper's coat. She recognized the pattern instantly. She moved closer, her rifle at the ready, her eyes searching the surrounding trees and undergrowth. There, partly obscured by a bush, was Jasper's backpack, dropped or discarded, the contents spilled onto the snowy ground. A sudden rustle to her right caused her to spin, bringing her rifle up in one smooth motion. Her breath caught in her throat as she found herself staring into a pair of wild, desperate eyes, Jasper's. He was half-crouched, half-collapsed against a tree, his face pale, his breaths ragged. "Jasper!" Ellie rushed to his side, her concern momentarily overruling her caution. "What happened? Where were you?" Jasper grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "It's here," he gasped, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Watching us, hunting us. I saw it, Ellie. It's not just a story. It's real." The fear in his eyes was infectious, and Ellie felt a cold shiver run down her spine as she helped him to his feet. "Come on, we need to get back to the others," she urged, glancing nervously around the clearing. They made their way back to the rendezvous point, Jasper leaning heavily on Ellie. The forest seemed to press in on them, alive with unseen threats and the heavy presence of their hunter turned hunted. As they emerged into the clearing where they were to meet Silas and Tom, the relief at seeing their companions alive and unharmed was palpable. However, the news Jasper brought, and the undeniable evidence of his encounter, hung over them like a dark cloud as they prepared to face what lay ahead. They were not just in the wilderness, they were in the domain of the Wendigo, and it was closing in. As dawn edged its pale light through the fog, the hunters, weary from a night of guarded sleep, prepared to move. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a soft, eerie light over their haggard faces. Each was silently aware that today's journey would not be like the ones before. Today, they hunted not for game, but for answers, and possibly for their very survival. Silas took the lead, his experienced eyes scanning the terrain with a vigilance honed by decades in the wilderness. "We need to find where it's been staying, its lair," he murmured, adjusting the straps of his backpack with steady, methodical movements. "That's where we'll find what we're looking for." Tom nodded, checking the load in his rifle. The weight of the weapon in his hands was a small comfort against the uncertainty of what lay ahead. "We track it from where we saw it last," he suggested, pointing towards the ridge where the shadowy figure had vanished the day before. The terrain was rugged, unforgiving, as they made their way toward the ridge. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees towering like silent sentinels, their branches swaying in a gentle breeze that carried an undercurrent of menace. As they approached the area, Ellie, with her sharp young eyes, noticed a subtle path, an almost imperceptible disturbance in the underbrush that led deeper into the forest. "Over here," she called out softly, her voice tense. "Something's been moving through here. Regularly." Following the trail felt like descending into the depths of a dark ocean. The light dimmed, filtered through the dense canopy above, casting everything in a perpetual twilight. The air grew colder, the breath of each hunter visible as they exhaled, watching their misty breaths swirl and fade into the chilled air. The path, increasingly defined, wound through the woods, skirting massive boulders and tangled thickets that tore at their clothes and skin. After what seemed like hours, the forest opened up into a clearing, but it was unlike any other they had encountered before. In the center stood an ancient, gnarled tree, its bark blackened as if scorched by fire. At its base, a cave entrance yawned like the mouth of some great beast, dark and inviting. The ground around the tree was trampled, the snow stained in places with dark, dried patches that looked ominously like blood. "This is it," Silas stated, his voice a whisper that seemed loud in the oppressive silence. "Be ready for anything." They approached the cave cautiously, their weapons drawn, eyes darting to every shadow, every movement in the periphery. The entrance was low, forcing them to crouch as they entered, the air inside dank and filled with the smell of decay and old, dried blood. The cave extended back further than they had anticipated, the walls rough and jagged, the floor sloping downward into the darkness. Tom, who had taken point, held up his hand, signaling a halt. He switched on a flashlight, the beam cutting through the blackness to reveal the interior. The walls were covered in markings, crude representations of antlered figures and spirals that seemed to dance in the flickering light. Bones, both animal and disturbingly human, were scattered across the ground, some arranged in patterns that made Ellie shiver with dread. "This isn't just a den," Jasper said, his voice barely audible. "It's a shrine." Silas moved forward, examining the symbols on the walls with a grim fascination. "It's worshipping the hunt, the hunger, the transformation," he interpreted, his hand tracing a particularly elaborate spiral that ended with a figure with a grotesquely elongated mouth. As they ventured deeper, the cave narrowed, and they found themselves in a smaller chamber, this one containing a pile of belongings, tattered remnants of clothing, a few rusted tools, and, chillingly, a small, weather-beaten photo album. Ellie picked it up, flipping through the pages with trembling hands. The photos were old, faded, but unmistakably pictures of a family, a man, a woman, and a young boy. "It's him. Elias," she whispered, showing Silas the picture of the man they had heard so much about. His face, once full of life, now stared back at them from the past, hauntingly familiar. The realization of standing in the very heart of the Wendigo's lair, surrounded by the remnants of its past human life and its present monstrous existence, was overwhelming. Here, in this sacred and cursed place, the line between man and monster blurred terrifyingly. As they absorbed the gravity of their discovery, a sound echoed from the depths of the cave, a low, mournful howl that resonated with the sorrow and hunger of the Wendigo. They were not alone, and the true test of their resolve and survival was just beginning. The clearing, once a mere waypoint in their wilderness trek, now felt like a grim arena. Silas, Tom, and Ellie, their faces etched with concern, gathered around Jasper as he recounted his harrowing encounter. The reality of their situation had crystallized into a sharp, dangerous focus. They were not merely trespassers in the Wendigo's domain, they were prey. "We need a plan," Silas declared, his voice low but firm. "This thing, it's smart, and it's toying with us. We can't just run. We need to confront it, on our terms." Tom nodded, his usual reticence replaced by a grim determination. "Weapons ready, then. If it's hunting us, we make a stand here. Back to back, eyes open. We don't let it isolate any one of us again." Ellie checked her rifle, her hand steady despite the cold dread that gripped her heart. "What about fire? It's supposed to fear fire, right?" She recalled tales of mythical creatures and their aversions, grasping at any potential advantage. "Good thinking," Silas approved, pulling a flare from his backpack. "Fire might not kill it, but it could give us the edge we need to drive it off or—" His voice trailed off, the unspoken end of that sentence hanging heavy in the air. The hunters positioned themselves in a small circle, backs together, creating a 360-degree field of vision. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, the usual sounds of wildlife conspicuously absent, as if even the creatures of the woods feared what was about to unfold. As the shadows grew longer, the tension among the group became almost palpable. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig was met with tightened grips on rifle stocks and quick, darting glances. They waited, the anticipation a heavy cloak around them. Suddenly, a low, guttural growl rolled through the clearing, more felt than heard, vibrating through the ground and up their legs. It was a sound no human throat could produce, a sound of hunger, anger, and immense pain. "There!" Jasper hissed, pointing towards the north end of the clearing. The underbrush trembled, then parted, as a tall, gaunt figure emerged. It was the Wendigo, its eyes glowing with a malevolent, unnatural light, its limbs twisted and elongated grotesquely. Its appearance was a horrifying blend of human and creature, its skin pale and stretched taut over sharp, jutting bones. The Wendigo stopped at the edge of the clearing, its head tilting curiously as it regarded the hunters. Its gaze was unnerving, intelligent, and filled with a dark amusement. It seemed to understand the stakes of the confrontation, reveling in the fear it invoked. Tom was the first to react, firing a shot that echoed loudly through the still air. The bullet struck the creature in the shoulder, but it barely flinched, the wound seemingly of little consequence to it. Instead, it let out a shriek that chilled the blood, a sound of rage that promised retribution. Silas stepped forward, igniting the flare with a quick strike. The bright, burning light sizzled, casting a harsh, red glow over the scene. He thrust the flare towards the Wendigo, which recoiled slightly, its eyes narrowing against the brightness. "Keep it back!" Silas shouted, using the flare to direct the creature's movements, herding it like a shepherd with a wayward sheep. "Ellie, Jasper, flank it!" Ellie moved to the left, Jasper to the right, their rifles trained on the creature as they tried to circle around it. The Wendigo, realizing it was being manipulated, let out another horrific scream and charged at Ellie. Reacting quickly, Ellie fired, her shot hitting its mark in the creature's chest. The impact slowed it, but the Wendigo was relentless. It swiped at her with clawed hands, narrowly missing as she rolled away, the snow crunching under her weight. Jasper, seeing his chance, took a shot at the creature's back, hitting it near the spine. The Wendigo stumbled, its movements becoming erratic as the injuries began to take their toll. "We have it!" Jasper yelled, reloading his rifle quickly. "Keep pressure on it." The creature, now visibly weakened but still dangerous, eyed the flare in Silas's hand warily. It knew the fire was its bane, and with a low, menacing growl, it began to retreat, slowly backing into the forest from whence it came. The hunters did not pursue. They stood their ground, watching as the dark figure disappeared into the trees, its departure marked by a trail of dark blood staining the pure white snow. As the adrenaline began to ebb, the reality of their survival settled in. They had faced the mythical Wendigo and lived to tell the tale. But the victory was not without its cost, the encounter leaving them shaken, their view of the natural world forever altered. "Let's get out of here," Tom said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Before it decides to come back." They collected their gear, casting wary glances at the shadows that lingered just beyond the reach of their lights. As they made their way back to camp, the weight of their experience hung between them, a silent acknowledgment that some legends are rooted deeply in truth, and some horrors are too real to ever fully forget. The journey back to their makeshift camp was one marked by a heavy silence, punctuated only by the crunch of their boots on the crisp snow and the occasional low conversation as they checked in on one another's welfare. The battle with the Wendigo had left its scars, both physical and mental, and each step they took was a reminder of the fine line they walked between the known world and the realms of ancient myths turned terrifying reality. As they approached the camp, the first thing Silas did was bolster the fire, the flames leaping towards the dark sky as if reaching for safety. The light pushed back the oppressive darkness, a small circle of safety in the vast, threatening wilderness. "We can't stay here long," Tom stated flatly, his eyes scanning the tree-line. "It knows where we are now. We need to make for the ranger station at dawn. It's a long trek, but they have radios." Ellie nodded in agreement, her face pale but set in a determined line. "We need to warn others. If it's still out there, wounded and angry, it's going to be even more dangerous." The group set about preparing for the night, their movements automatic. The routine tasks of setting up camp were tinged with a vigilance that had not been there before. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves had them reaching for their weapons, their nerves frayed to breaking point. Jasper, nursing a sprained wrist from his fall during the confrontation, sat close to the fire, the heat comforting against the chill that had seeped deep into his bones. "Do you think it'll come back?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if afraid to raise the ire of the unseen monsters lurking just beyond the firelight. Silas, adding another log to the fire, kept his gaze fixed on the flames. "It might, but it took some hits. We hurt it, maybe enough to make it think twice about attacking us again." "We should set watches," Ellie suggested, pulling her coat tighter around her. "2 at a time, keep the fire high, and stay alert." They organized quickly, pairs designated to watch while the others tried to snatch some rest, though sleep was a distant hope for most. The night stretched on, a taut string ready to snap at the slightest provocation. During the second watch, with Tom and Ellie keeping vigil, a distant howling echoed through the trees, different from the wind, more mournful and filled with a lingering pain. Ellie gripped her rifle tighter, her eyes searching the darkness where each shadow could conceal their nightmarish foe. Tom, ever the pragmatist, kept his voice low. Could be it calling out to something, or someone. These creatures are old, maybe as old as the woods themselves. Who knows what kinds of calls they answer to? Ellie shivered, not just from the cold. Let's hope it's not calling anything else to it. One Wendigo is enough. As their shift ended and Silas and Jasper took over, the sky began to lighten, the darkest part of the night passing into the early blue of dawn. The forest seemed to wake slowly, the life within it cautious, as if aware of the drama that had unfolded in its shadows. With the coming of dawn, the group packed up their camp with practiced efficiency. They doused the fire, leaving no trace of their presence, save for the flattened snow where their tents had stood. The hike to the ranger station was a quiet one, each lost in their own thoughts, their eyes constantly roving. The station, when it finally came into view, was a sight more beautiful than any sunrise. Nestled on the edge of a clearing, its sturdy, log-built walls promised safety and a return to a world that made sense, away from ancient spirits and monsters of legend. The ranger on duty, seeing their haggard appearance and the weapons they carried so openly, raised an eyebrow but waved them in. After quick introductions and the essential summary of their ordeal, the ranger, a seasoned veteran named Marlene, listened with a somber expression. "I've heard stories," she admitted, pouring them each a strong cup of coffee. "Old stories from the tribes hereabouts. Never thought I'd see folks who'd faced one and lived to talk about it." She promised to send out warnings to the other stations and organize a watch. The forest would be monitored more closely, and the legend of the Wendigo would be taken as a serious caution. As the hunters sat in the relative safety of the ranger station, sipping the hot coffee and allowing the warmth to seep back into their bones, there was a collective sense of relief mixed with the irrevocable knowledge that their lives had changed. They had glimpsed a world that existed parallel to their own, a world where legends breathed and hungered. It was a truth that would weigh on their souls, a story that would burn in their minds like the fire that had kept the darkness at bay. As the early morning sun cast its pale light through the windows of the ranger station, the group gathered around a worn wooden table, their bodies exhausted but minds restless. Marlene, the ranger, had offered more than just refuge. She provided a listening ear and a gateway to the wider community of those who patrol and protect these vast wilderness areas. Silas, who had taken the role of the group's unspoken leader, traced the grain of the wood with a calloused finger, his thoughts far away. "We've seen something that's supposed to be just a story, a myth to scare kids," he mused aloud. His voice was low, carrying a weight of realization and wonder. "And now we're part of that story." Ellie, sitting beside him, nodded. Her young face was drawn, shadows under her eyes not just from lack of sleep, but from the depth of what they had experienced. "We can't just forget what happened. It feels like a responsibility, doesn't it? To tell others, to warn them." Tom, who had been quiet, his usual stoicism like a shield, finally spoke. "Not everyone's going to believe us. And some who do might think of hunting it, turning these woods into a battleground." His concern was evident, the implication of their encounter reaching beyond their immediate survival to broader consequences. Jasper, who had been flipping through a stack of old Park Service maps and wildlife reports, looked up. "Maybe that's our role now. To educate, to make sure the story isn't about glory or trophies but about respect and caution." Marlene, overhearing the conversation, added her perspective. "The forest has its own way of balancing things. We, as rangers, try to protect these lands, but we're also guardians of its stories. What you've experienced is part of a larger narrative, one that includes conservation, respect for nature, and maybe a bit of the supernatural." She pulled out a larger map, spreading it on the table. "We'll increase patrols in the area, keep an eye out for unusual activity. And I'll communicate with the local tribes. They might be willing to share insights or historical encounters with the Wendigo. Your experience could be a valuable addition to our collective knowledge." The group agreed to provide detailed statements and assist in any way they could. As they spoke, the reality of their new bond, forged by shared terror and survival, settled in. They were no longer just weekend warriors seeking thrills in the wilderness. They were custodians of a dark secret, guardians of a truth that blurred the lines between myth and reality. As the meeting concluded, each prepared to leave, knowing that the return to their everyday lives would be anything but ordinary. The wilderness had imprinted itself upon them in ways they could not have anticipated. Ellie lingered by the door, looking back at the map. "Do you think it will come back?" "After it heals?" she asked Marlene, her tone tinged with both fear and a morbid curiosity. Marlene considered the question seriously. "If it does, we'll be better prepared. And we're not going to let our guard down. Not now that we know what's out there." The drive home was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. The roads, framed by the dense forests on either side, felt like a corridor between worlds. They were leaving the domain of the Wendigo, but a part of it was coming with them, nestled in their memories, ever present. Silas dropped each member of the group off at their homes, the goodbyes sober and reflective. When he finally arrived at his own cabin, he found himself standing at the edge of the woods, looking into the shadows between the trees. The forest seemed to watch him in return, its silence a deep, resounding echo of the events that had transpired. Silas realized then that the wilderness would never be just a place of beauty and solitude for him again. It was a living, breathing entity, filled with stories of survival, terror, and the thin veneers between worlds. As the cold dawn broke into a brighter day, Silas felt a resolve settle within him, a new purpose. He would return to the woods, respect its boundaries, and protect its secrets, for he knew now more than ever that the legends it held were not just tales to be told around campfires. They were warnings, lessons in humility and respect for the wild spaces of the world. And somewhere, deep in the heart of the woods, the Wendigo watched, waited, and healed, its legend growing, ever hungry, ever present.